All right, so this I'll just start. This is my a journal my mom got me for Christmas. It's got a tree on it, so it's very appropriate. And I've been sort of taking notes on some trees in my neighborhood. I live in a suburb of Vancouver, and there's a lot of tree diversity. I've got about there's got to be at least 50 different varieties of trees in my neighborhood. But just today on my wanderings, I was making notes of apple trees, walnut trees, paper birch, Norway maple, pin oak, linden or lime trees, tulip poplars, holly trees, beech trees, Norway. Oh, I said that, didn't I? Norway maple, cypress, cherry, black locust, and atlas cedar. So there's a ton of trees in my neighborhood, and they're all. Can you, if you're not talking, can you mute your microphones?
Sure.
There we go. Yeah, if you're not talking, can you mute? Great. And so one of the trees that I really love is this black locust tree, which is sort of on the corner, the north west corner of my block. And it's got to be maybe 100 years old. And these neighborhoods used to be old orchards and farms before they were subdivided. And I think it was probably one of the yard trees for the farmhouse in this neighborhood, because it's just enormous. And when I go running, I run around the block, and it's a tree that I pass every lap. And it just finished flowering, and so all the flowers are on the ground and the seeds are coming out. And it just has these big sort of gnarly furrowed bark, and it's just a really cool tree to be around. So that's my kind of day-to-day. I spend almost every day on walks in my neighborhood, either in the cemetery by my house or in my neighborhood. There's a couple of parks. There's lots of wonderful trees in my area. And I also wanted to show folks this, if you didn't see it last week, because the assignment 0 is to either get a guidebook and pick out 20 trees and sort of get familiar with those trees kind of on a daily basis, almost like a meditation. And guidebooks are great for that, but they usually focus on pretty specific ecological stuff. But another way to go is something like this. This is what's called an oracle card deck. And some people use them as like kind of a divination tool. Like they'll use them to kind of, like tarot cards or something. But they come in a deck of about, there's probably 40 or 50 different trees. And so what I usually do in the morning is I'll just pull a card from the deck randomly and just sort of sit with the meaning of that tree for the day, because the book has a little description of the mythology and the lore behind those trees. So today was the ash tree, and it has some really cool associations with European divinities and medicinal plants and things. So I spent some time with that. So yeah, if you're still wondering what maybe to do with the assignment 0, that's an option. Is more of those are oracle cards. But does anyone want to share any of their reflections from the first journal assignment? Jason Dilworth sent me a really beautiful PDF document of some photographs from his front, or I guess front yard, with some mushrooms and some beautiful trees. Anyone want to talk about their experience?
Yeah, I can. So I'm trying to build my sketchbook for the class, and of course I had to sort of like lay it out. So it's individual pages, and I've been reading Merlin Sheldrake's Entangled Life, and in it the illustrations were sort of done with I guess just an ink cap mushroom, and just by chance I went out the other day and I noticed a bunch of mushrooms popping up in the yard. Took them in a jar, collected them, and I've been sort of like intending to use those to complement some of the sketches that sort of go around that is assignment 0. But I think I've been sort of stuck, like so many of us, kind of in quarantine, and been noticing my yard for the last 4 months, and really paying attention to each of the trees there. And I was particularly drawn to one ash tree at the very back of our lot, which is infested and dying from the emerald ash borer, and decided to leave it, just sort of let it take its course. Right now, you're getting sort of these basil sprouts coming out of it that are disappearing. I don't know, they arrive at night and then they're gone the next day. It seems kind of magical. But this tree it's really, there's so much life around it. I've got a small black willow that it grew from a cutting or just sort of a discarded limb that's going right at the base of it, and it's grown about 3 feet. It's just sort of a nice little part of the lot. It's kind of been a nice investigation to sit with it for a while.
Yeah. That's great. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. Anyone else want to share reflections from the first journal?
I'll go.
Okay.
I didn't put this in my journal, but I live in West Vancouver, and it's on a double lot, a teeny tiny little house, but on a big lot with a lot of trees. And there's Douglas fir, and there's laurels. There's a bunch of blackberry, but the tree that most interests me is I think it's called an incense cedar, and it's multi-stem. I think there's, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There's 6 stems, which are quite large, and it's a big, super beautiful tree with a sort of bluish green tinge to the needles, and a sort of red flaky bark. I don't know what the history is of this tree, but it sticks out, compared to all the other trees. It's a lot bigger, and yeah, it's just
cool. Good. Yeah, a lot of these experiences aren't going to be like, I had this kind of experience, right? Like a lot of the time we spend with trees is sort of beyond words, or just doesn't use words, right? So don't feel like you have to be, words upon words about these trees. I think a bit of the exercise of the workshop is to begin to be mindful of those moments, right? Even if we don't need to name them or put words to them, just being able to, be there, right? And notice them. Great. Any other reflections from journal 1?
I have one. I have a reflection.
Great.
Well, I'll show you the leaf of the tree.
Okay.
I think it might be, that's the leaf. Okay, can you see that?
Yes.
Do you know what that is? It's that there's the leaves of it. I don't know if it's a cherry blossom or what, but this is I drew the tree, okay?
Wow, cool.
Yeah, it's got a very thick trunk on it, and it's got like lots of layers on it, and then it has, you can see the branches going up, and then it goes out like a crescent, like it's very beautiful the way it's shaped. It's on the road I live on. It's in a person's garden. And it goes way out. It's at the very edge of their garden though. It goes way out like that, and it's like a crescent. see. Yeah, so I felt like there was something about the tree that it seemed to give me some rest. It's sort of like, it's a restful tree. It was peaceful or restful. It seemed like to have that kind of personality, that it was more like happy. The tree was happy in itself, like it was proud of itself. It also has two pieces that come off the end of the tree there, like two little trunks, or two little pieces of the tree, like there's two little stems that come from the trunk with some leaves on it.
Okay.
Okay, that's one. And then the other is in my garden, in my back garden. There are roses.
Oh, lovely.
I love roses. Have a good few roses. Now the roses, it's a climbing rose, so I've mixed in the roses with clematis, and so the roses and clematis are all along the wall. But these are Rosa Henry Kelsey. So I know I know a lot about roses, but so I find roses are very bright and colorful, and when I look at roses, they make me happy. And I always think of petals. I'm interested in history. When Napoleon would come back from fighting, Josephine would put all the roses on the steps going into their house, all the way up the steps into their bedroom, and all their bed was filled with rose petals. That's the story.
Wow.
So it's very romantic. It's got a very romantic feeling to roses.
Cool. Great. Thanks for sharing, Sandra.
Okay.
All right. Anyone else want to share before we get going into the content?
Jason, I have a question. Sort of starting with the furniture. You got me investigating. I went down into the basement of the house to learn more about the timbers, where it came from. Our house was built in the 1980s.
Okay.
Some kiln dried Keystone lumber, and then the home would be cedar. And I was curious about sort of just like the distribution, if you have any insights into the kind of the timber industry and maybe how it's changed, or maybe it's something that's going to come up in the class. Because where things are being sourced now, the timbers down below are pretty good. It's much nicer than any 2x4s I could pick up at anywhere. So like the 2x4s now they're wider. These ones are pretty substantial, and that was only 30 or 40 years ago.
Huh. Yeah, I don't. That's a good question. Where they would have been sourcing timber in the 1980s in New York, right? But it really just depends. You'd have to look into the manufacture of the homes, if it was built by a developer, or was it built by the owner themselves, right? But a lot of timber is coming from Canada, right? Because Canada has these massive softwood markets, which have been kind of diminished a bit by all the forest fires, but still a lot of timber is coming out of Canada. And that's kind of a ongoing back and forth with the US and Canada over tariffs and timber and that sort of thing. But yeah, and then a lot of our IKEA furniture, right, is like the softwood, fir and pine, knotty pine that's coming out of Europe, right? All right, Jay Brown, did you have a reflection?
Am I unmuted now? I can't remember. I can't get this button to work right. Hear me?
Yes.
We have a couple of mesquite trees on our property, one in front and one over to the side of our garage. And looking at my little guide here, it seems to be described as a screw bean mesquite.
Okay.
So we have one that's very, very successful by our garage. And Holly pointed out that it serves as shade for some of the bees that come and pollinate our garden and our fruit trees. So
Very cool. Are the seed pods twisty like that?
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Corkscrew? Okay.
Next week I'll get a little pod and bring it in and show you.
Okay.
But there were some here in this little guide that I thought I might share. On our horseback ride last week, we saw some burrow bush, and we saw some creosote, and we saw some, let's see, what was this? I guess it would be the big sagebrush. We were riding through on our way to the Salt River. So, there's some smaller shrubs rather than trees, but they make up a lot of the landscape.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, they're woody plants, so they're definitely connected to trees.
I think the biggest presence in everything that we do when we're out riding is the saguaro cactus. It's interesting to see in this particular ecozone how they almost look like a forest. They're so dense sometimes. It's interesting to see, especially out by Canyon Lake as you drive the highway to get down to it. It looks like soldiers marching down this hill to come to the highway. So, kind of.
Yeah, they make some really interesting silhouettes sometimes.
Yeah,
look like people.
Yes, they do.
Kind of like desert ants or something, which we'll talk about today. Cool. Well, that's awesome. Julia, did you have any? Okay, great. Then I'm just going to launch into the PowerPoint. Feel free to mute your videos and your microphones. And then don't be shy if something goes weird with the slides and you can't see them for some reason. Let me know, but otherwise, let's just write down questions for the end so that it can be a solid block of the content for the asynchronous folks if they want to just watch that part. All right. Any logistical questions? Great. Let's see. Share screen. All right. There we go. So yeah, this week we're doing, the theme is the primeval forest, trees and forests in myth, religion, and literature. Our learning objectives are twofold: explore the role of trees and forests in the world's religious and spiritual systems, and we'll talk a little bit about trees in mythology and literature as well. I wanted to start with the role of trees in a mythological category called the world tree. So many cultures have this concept of a world tree, something that centers the cosmos. You could call it an axis mundi, like the center of the world, right? The world revolves around this thing. And it is often conceptualized as a tree. So in Norse mythology, we have the Yggdrasil. And the Yggdrasil is a world tree. So the Norse, the Vikings, the Norse people imagined the cosmos to be organized in these different levels, with the underworld, as you can see on the slide, having the domains of the giants and the land of ice and the realm of the dead, the dwarves and raging fire and elves. So that's the underworld. There's a giant serpent slowly gnawing at the roots of the Yggdrasil, which is a kind of allusion to the passing of time. There's a rainbow bridge that connects the middle, the worlds, the underworld, and the heavenly realms. And we live in Midgard, right, the middle land. That's where people live. And in the heavenly realm was places like Valhalla, right? Asgard was the heavenly realm of the Yggdrasil. And so it was imagined that the world was centered by this great tree, and it was sort of stacked in this way. So their cosmology was sort of arboreal, I guess you'd say. It was a tree-shaped universe. We know about this through the poetic and the prose Edda, which are basically chronicles of Norse mythology. And in stanza 19 of the Edda, it says, "And ash I know there stands Yggdrasil is its name, a tall tree showered in shining loam. From there come the dews that drop in the valleys. It stands forever green in earth's well. And so the tree is at the center of the cosmos, and these I guess sort of godlike beings called the Norns. The Norns stood guard at the well, the earth's well, and determined the fates of everyone on earth. And it was imagined that at the end of time, the Yggdrasil would be destroyed, and creation would begin anew from a sprout from the Yggdrasil. So this is, I think, the best illustration of that motif, right? That notion of a world tree. And there's lots of other versions of that, but it's very common to imagine the world as a kind of tree. If we go now to the Hebrew Bible and look at the role of trees, we see the Hebrew Bible begins with a tree, right? The tree of life, the Etz Chaim, is at the center of the garden planted by God for Adam and Eve. But it's also, a tree is also what gets Adam and Eve exiled from the same garden, right? The tree of knowledge of good and evil. They're kind of held as in opposition to each other, right? And so in Hebrew poetry, trees and human beings are often sort of compared to each other, right? They are almost interchangeable in a sense, that trees are alive and they can reproduce themselves, and human beings are alive and they can reproduce themselves. And the human beings emerge from the soil like trees, right? So the Hebrew Bible really does begin in a garden of trees. In Hebrew polytheism, so before they were very strict about their monotheism, trees were kind of a representation of, or central, a focal point for the worship of the consort of Yahweh, which is Asherah. Asherah is the female counterpart to Yahweh in Hebrew polytheism. So we have some allusions to trees there. She's associated with trees. In Proverbs, the trees are associated with wisdom, right? Wisdom grows like a tree. The Torah scrolls that you see in contemporary synagogues are also imagined as Etz Chaim, or a tree of life. And the cabinets that house the Torah scrolls are often decorated with trees. In Kabbalah, which is the mystical tradition of Judaism, the emanations of God, the Sephirot, there are 10 sort of points of emanations from God, and each of these corresponds with a point in the physical world and the inner world. So there's a kind of, they use that image of the tree of life to talk about the way to harmonize our inner world with the outer world. And of course the menorah, right, which is a symbol of contemporary Judaism, is thought to probably have derived from those early polytheistic symbols like the Asherah poles. All right, in Christianity, so if you take the Christian Bible, a tree begins in Genesis with the tree of life, but the tree of life also shows up at the end, right? The book of Revelation ends with the tree of life as well. So it's fairly interesting that the kind of the markers of the beginning and the end of the Christian Bible are trees. And at the sort of meridian of the Bible, the climax of the Bible as Christians see it would be the cross. And that has also been imagined and written about as a kind of tree of life. So you can see the icon on this slide depicts Christ on the cross as a kind of fertile plant, right? The life of the world comes out of this symbol of death and resurrection. And one of the more remarkable poems, I think, to come out of Christianity is this poem called "The Dream of the Rood," and the rood just means like a rod or a tree. And it's basically, I think it's remarkable because it personifies the wood of the cross. So the tree that is cut down to be the cross for the crucifixion reflects on being cut down and used in the crucifixion. And I'll just read it for you because it's pretty amazing, but this is just a very small part of it. And this is somewhere between the 8th and 10th century Old English poem. So here we go. Then Best Wood spoke these words. It was long since, I yet remember it, that I was hewn at Holt's End, moved from my stem. Strong fiends seized me there, worked me for spectacle, cursed ones lifted me. On shoulders men bore me there, then fixed me on hill. Fiends enough fastened me. Then saw I mankind's Lord come with great courage when he would mount on me. Then dared I not against the Lord's word bend or break when I saw earth's fields shake. All fiends I could have felled, but I stood fast. The young hero stripped himself, he, God Almighty, strong and stout-minded. He mounted high gallows, bold before many, when he would loose mankind. I shook when that man clasped me. I dared still not bow to earth, fall to earth's fields, but had to stand fast. Rude was I reared. I lifted a mighty king. Lord of the heavens, dared not to bend. So I think it's a remarkable poem in itself, but what really got my attention is the personification of the tree, which we're going to talk about a little bit more next week, but it's a theme running throughout the course, right? This question of, do we perceive trees as objects or subjects or persons in a sense? And I like to flag this poem as an example of Christianity imagining trees as persons, even if it is this sort of poetic form. All right, moving to the Islamic tradition. In Islam, heaven is imagined as a kind of Garden of Eden, as a garden, and there's certainly trees there, but I think the Zakum tree is a little more exciting because it's the tree at the center of hell, right? So the Zakum tree is the sort of fire-fed, bitter fruit where the heads are shaped like the devil, right? So it's this very gruesome and terrifying kind of image of a tree, right? So not all warm and fuzzy, but the Quran says, "Verily, the tree of Zakum will be the food of the sinful, like molten brass; it will boil in their insides." Right? So, a very gruesome image of hell. All right, a few words on Buddhism and Hinduism, keeping in mind our Norse, the Yggdrasil of the world tree. The banyan tree, the ficus trees, Ficus religiosa and Ficus bengalensis, are both kind of world trees in their own right in the Hindu and Buddhist traditions. So the banyan tree is a symbol of eternal life. If you've seen banyan trees, they sprawl out from these central stems, and they walk in a sense because the roots descend from the branches and then they root into the ground, and and those grow. They're kind of like stilts, so they can kind of move in a way. In the Bhagavad Gita, which is a sacred text in Hinduism, Lord Krishna teaches Arjuna, who's a warrior, that the Ashvatha tree, which is a ficus tree, it grows in reverse. So its roots are in heaven and its branches come down to earth. And it's imagined as a kind of embodiment or symbol of Brahman or God. God sort of pervades and gives life to the world. And in Buddhism, Siddhartha Gautama, who becomes the Buddha, sits at the foot of the Bodhi tree, the Ficus religiosa, um, before he realizes his enlightenment. Right? So there is a kind of cosmic center, right, for Buddhism. This is the center of the world for Buddhists, where the Buddha is enlightened. So here's an image of that Ashvatha tree, who's with roots in heaven, there with Lord Vishnu in the roots, and his consort Parvati in the trunk, and the branches below. And in the Padma Purana, it says, "There is nothing on earth as great as Vishnu in the form of an Ashvatha tree." So many Hindus would venerate or worship the ficus tree because of its associations with Vishnu. And in contemporary temples, especially at the Mahabodhi temple, which is both a Hindu and a Buddhist temple, these trees are venerated and protected and are often an important part of the temple courtyards. In the pre-Christian European world, the Celtic calendar of 13 months, at least 11 of the months are represented by trees. So the script, the runes that they used, and the trees were all connected to the months of the year. So birch trees, rowan trees, ash trees, alder, willow, hawthorn, oak, holly, and hazel. Each of those trees had a kind of sacred designation in those months, and each of them had their own kind of associations with Celtic polytheism, different medicines and foods, and different aspects of Celtic mythology. And so moving from that idea of the world tree to tree spirits or wishing trees. So this would be the idea that either the tree itself is a kind of spiritual being, or the tree itself houses some kind of spiritual being. So in animistic cultures that believe in the spiritual personhood of non-human beings, animistic cultures often would elevate trees to that kind of status, right? Gods and goddesses would often take the form of trees or be associated with particular trees. Certain spiritual beings or even ancestors would be associated with certain species of trees. And some trees would just be focal points for prayer. Like you can see in this slide, in Ireland, there's a lot of wishing trees where people bring small flags and tie them to the branches of trees. And on my walk today, I was walking past a tree and I saw 3 ribbons tied to the branch of a tree, and it made me think of these wishing trees. So in Greek mythology, that animistic tendency is all over Greek mythology. So we have dryads, who are a kind of nymph, these nature spirits associated with trees, usually kind of anthropomorphized in art, as you can see here, and very shy and often feminine, and always associated with the goddess Artemis, who's the goddess of hunting and of the forest. Zeus is always associated with oak trees. I think oaks have a for some reason, really attract lightning. So I think Zeus as a kind of high god, sky god, was often associated with oak trees. And his oracle, the place where Zeus communicated with shamans and temple priests at Dodona, was centered by an oak tree. And so Zeus is always associated with oak trees. In Ovid's fable, Bacchus and Philemon are an older married couple, and they are the only ones in their village to welcome Zeus and Hermes, who are disguised. So for their hospitality, they are rewarded by being transformed into a pair of oak and linden trees that are sort of entangled or intertwined. And so throughout Greek mythology, we get these stories of either tree spirits like the dryads, the Hamadryads, or associations with sky gods like Zeus, or these transformations of human beings or demigods or gods into trees. And so the associations with trees are all over Greek mythology. In James Fraser, this is a sort of very early compiled book of mythology and ethnographic research, The Golden Bough. He goes through and talks about tree spirits and tree worshiping, and he kind of elicits this sense of subjectivity in trees. And by that I mean people would be very wary of cutting down trees because of their associations with certain either regional spirits or certain gods in a pantheon or ancestors. So Fraser writes, if trees are animate, they are necessarily sensitive, and the cutting of them down becomes a delicate surgical operation, which must be performed as tender a regard as possible for the feelings of the sufferers, who otherwise may turn and rend the careless or bungling operator. When an oak is being felled, it gives a kind of shrieks or groans that may be heard a mile off, as if it were the genius of the oak lamenting. And genius just means the spirit. So this was a fairly pervasive understanding of trees and forests, I guess, in pre-Christian Europe, that forests and trees were associated with spiritual beings or gods or goddesses or ancestors. And you couldn't just willy-nilly cut these down. You had to go through the proper channels and placate the right people before you could cut anything down. The Iroquois, in their confederacy, elevated the white pine as a symbol of peace, right? They brought together the Mohawk, the Onondagas, the Onondagas, and the Cayugas, and the Senecas into a confederation, which some people have pointed out was a early inspiration for the American system of government. But the white pine was a kind of symbol of the four directions, the four roots going in each direction, and the weapons of war being buried under a white pine, so that the white pine became a symbol of the Confederacy and of the peace treaty that they had come to. In Shinto, which is the indigenous religion of Japan, trees are a big part of their shrines. So Shinto shrines basically incarnate what are called kami. And kami are the sort of spiritual beings that created the world and that inhabit the world. So there's heavenly kami and earthly kami. And trees, as you can see here, that are sacred, are marked by these ropes that designate them as markers of a temple boundary or as being inhabited by a specific kami. So the shinboku, these shrines, are encircled with sacred trees. And this one at the bottom here, you can see is, I think, over 3,000 years old. All right. To the Philippines. The bullet tree is another kind of fig tree. It's not the banyan or the pipal tree. It's a probably 15 to 20 different species of figs, which some of them are the strangler fig variety. So strangler figs are figs that tend to germinate on the branches of other trees and sort of hang out there for a while, but eventually put down roots and overtake the tree that they are host to. So they're kind of parasitic plants in that way. And the indigenous people of the Philippines imagine that many species of these strangler figs are inhabited by what are called anito. And that can be anything from a mythical creature, these kind of horse-hooved monsters, to these titular spirits, which are basically guardians of a particular domain, like this forest or that river or that mountain. They can be inhabited by totemic spirits, and totems are just spirits associated with some particular species of animal or plant. They can be anthropomorphic spirits, so ancestors or mythical human beings that then dwell in the trees, or they can be housing malevolent spirits, which do bad things to people. The baleta trees are protected and venerated for that reason, but they're also, embedded in a wider landscape. So mountains and anthills, waterfalls and caves, and even some carvings out of wood. Each of those can house different anito. So it's an animistic kind of worldview, and the strangler figs are a big part of that. The Tanah Toraja are a Indonesian indigenous group that will carve small niches out of trees and bury stillborn babies so that the tree eventually grows around them. So I put this in the slides because it's a very interesting contemporary indigenous practice associated with trees and tree spirits. And the Coast Salish people, who are the sort of federation of indigenous peoples along the Oregon, Washington, and British Columbian coast, also practice a kind of tree burial, so that the corpses of their loved ones wouldn't be eaten by predators like wolves or bears. They would often bury them in high platforms at the top of Douglas fir or cedar trees. And Coast Salish people have a very strong affection and use for red cedar trees, or Thuja plicata. So they're considered what we would call a cultural keystone. So they're essential to a lot of the carving and regalia for ceremony and potlatch, for boxes and ceremonial masks, for canoes, and for cordage. Red cedar is used in all of these traditional uses. And sometimes if you're hiking in the forest around here, you'll see these sort of narrow strips taken out of a piece of a red cedar, and usually you can tell that they've been culturally modified either recently or in the past. And so a lot of traditional territories in the Northwest are working with the provincial governments to try to expand tribal parks and co-management strategies in order to be more sensitive to culturally modified trees like these cedars, to restore forest ecosystems so that these cultural keystone species are available for when Coast Salish peoples want to make canoes or totem poles or ceremonial masks. So that's a big kind of up and coming resource management area, is these learning how to integrate cultural values into forest and resource management here in BC, which has been primarily dominated by big timber corporations. All right, so we're going to transition now into the forest. We just did a bunch of slides on various aspects and background of trees, but I want to talk about forests now. So you may have read the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is a Mesopotamian, early Mesopotamian hero's journey, where Gilgamesh goes on this kind of heroic journey to defeat the demon Humbaba, who is a titular deity of a cedar forest appointed by the god Enlil, a Mesopotamian god. And Humbaba is this sort of terrifying demon who guards the cedar forest. And Gilgamesh, with Enkidu, his sort of wild man companion, they defeat Humbaba and are able to cut down the sacred forest and ship the timbers back to Uruk. Now, of course, there's a lot more to this story of Gilgamesh, but it's a very early interesting association with, or a relationship between the god of this forest, the domain of this forest, and the politics of the day, right? So in order for Gilgamesh to conquer territory, he has to deal with the gods first, right? So along those same lines of James Fraser talking about cutting down a tree, Gilgamesh had to defeat a demon in order to clear cut the sacred forest. All right. European paganism maintained sacred groves. So not only were, forest lands used for grazing animals or gathering firewood or medicine, but certain hilltops and other groves were consecrated to a range of deities. So Druids and Celtic polytheism, the word Druid is derived, it was basically a synonym for the word oak tree. So the priests of the Druids worshipped in these groves of oak trees, where they probably carried out sacrifice, definitely animal sacrifice, but probably human sacrifices as well. Greek sacred groves, the temenos, were on hilltops, and they were devoted to any number of Greek gods and goddesses. And the trees within those precincts were not to be cut and were always sacred. The Roman pantheon were also worshipped in these sacred groves that would often either be associated with a god or they would be adorning a temple area, right? So the Lucas are the Roman sacred groves, and passerbys would make offerings. There's, very detailed instructions about how to offer a pig to the god or the goddesses at the sacred groves, and cutting was strictly prohibited. And if you're traveling around Italy and you find words like Lugo or Lucas, you can be confident that those had pre-Christian sacred groves associated with them. And I think it's pretty obvious that when we get to the Greek columns, the temple columns, and then even the European Catholic cathedral columns, that those columns are arboreal, right? They're meant to symbolize the sacred groves of paganism, or at least point us back to those sacred groves, and in some cases to be, just trees themselves. If you go to the Gaudi Cathedral in Barcelona, the Sagrada Familia, those columns that hold up the cathedral are branched, so they're much more obviously tree-shaped. Another aspect of trees and forests are these, like I was talking about earlier, these tutelary deities that are gods of a domain. So the Leshy is a from Slavic mythology, and he was a anthropomorphized spirit or god associated with the forest. So trees and forests, especially in the European domain, were not places of leisure. They were often places of danger because of their association with certain gods. And they're often anthropomorphic, and they're often shape-shifting, right? They can take different forms, which kind of right lends itself to that danger and mystery behind the trees. All right, coming into the fore, like the contemporary interactions with trees and forests. India is one of the world's most diverse and abundant sources of sacred groves today. So many indigenous communities and Hindu communities in India will have a sacred grove associated with their village, either centrally or peripherally, because some of these gods are not to be, trifled with. The reason they have these groves is because they're dangerous. They need to be, on the outskirts of town. But it's estimated there's probably around 150,000 of these groves. Some of them as small as an acre, some of them, 10 to 20 acres, 45 acres being the largest. So they're very diverse in their size. But what they often do is give us a kind of snapshot of what the local ecology might look like. Because India is so populous that a lot of the land is either developed or under cultivation. So Indian sacred groves and their association with the hundreds of deities in indigenous worship and the Hindu pantheon, their taboos around cutting trees, their taboos around destroying these forests has preserved a lot of the biodiversity. And so conservationists are very interested in, say, Indian sacred groves because of their ability to connect trees and forests and with protected areas, right? So kind of private groves, temple groves, and making these corridors between protected areas. Sub-Saharan Africa, even though it has been pretty intensely colonized by Islam and Christianity, a lot of the indigenous traditions are either maintaining or restoring sacred groves. So in Ghana and in Nigeria, there are many sacred groves that indigenous people maintain as sort of dwelling places for deities. Either as burial grounds for ancient royalty or as guardian spirits like water spirits, river spirits, or as Osun, some of the deities of Yoruba. The fertility goddess of Yoruba is a sort of protector deity of the sacred groves in sub-Saharan Africa. And again, conservationists are very interested in how these forests are contributing to protecting biodiversity. So for example, the Malshegu forest in Ghana is one of the last closed canopy forests in Ghana, just because of development and agricultural pressure there. Another example from Africa is the Ethiopian church forest. So Ethiopia is home to a kind of indigenous Christianity, and they will put their churches at the center of forests, which are often remnants of the indigenous ecology. So the Ethiopian church is a kind of a round structure, and they imagine that the forests are a kind of Garden of Eden, and worshipers come to the forest and to the church to worship, but go through the forest. And there's thousands of these churches in Ethiopia, and some of the land around these churches is up to 1,000 acres. So again, another religious practice contributing to the conservation of native biodiversity. And you can see them on Google Maps, right? This image here is just zoomed in northern Ethiopia. You can see at the center of the of this grove is right here is a little church, right? So yeah, it's kind of an interesting practice. And here's another image just zoomed up a little more. They have these churches at the center of these groves. Estonia is kind of an interesting case because it's a fairly secular country, but they maintain thousands of sacred sites, many of which are forests. So some of them can be up to 100 hectares, but they are mostly fairly small and modest forests. But they'll have these small shrines, these healing trees or stone, sacred stones, or trees where people tie memorabilia for the dead to remember their dead in these groves. So Estonia as a kind of secular post-Christian nation, over 65% of people still believe in a kind of pre-Christian paganism, or at least that trees have spirits. In North America, the Latter-day Saint tradition maintains a couple of historic sites, one of which is called the Sacred Grove. And the Latter-day Saint Sacred Grove is the imagined site of Joseph Smith Jr., who's the founder of Mormonism, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, where he reports having visions of an angel named Moroni and of a vision of God the Father and God the Son. So originally these groves were it was only a couple acres. It was about 7 acres or so. And you can see in this black and white photo that it was these big tall trees, but no understory. In the 1990s, the president of the church, Gordon Hinckley, hired a non-Mormon forester to come in and restore some of the trees or some of the area. So he put in some really narrow paths. They expanded the historic site to about 150 acres. And so now they're working to restore this hardwood forest to a kind of, modified old growth forest, so that pilgrims can go there and have that kind of spiritual experience that they, as they imagine the events that occurred there. Some other great examples in contemporary Buddhism, especially around Thailand and Cambodia, where the Theravadan monks have been fighting deforestation. So they've been ordaining trees as monks, so they'll wrap them in robes and have elaborate ceremonies for these trees. And that will often prevent illegal logging in the area, because they are associated with these monasteries and these monastic practices. In India, there was a very famous movement by what's called the Chipko movement, which just means to embrace, of these women who were preventing the cutting of trees in their watershed by, I think it was a baseball bat company. And they put themselves between the loggers and the trees and protected the trees, which were essential to their livelihoods, to their gathering and their water supply. So they are kind of an inspiration for contemporary Indian environmentalists. And there's also an organization called Eco-Sikh, which is the part of the Sikh religion. And they have been planting trees in commemoration of Guru Nanak, who's the founder of Sikhism, in commemoration of his 550th birthday, especially in and around his birthplace and the places where he had his conversion experience. Now, lastly, a few slides on literature, and then we can have a conversation. But I wanted to point out for the forests in Dante's Divine Comedy, one of the very first line of the Inferno, Dante finds himself in a dark wood. Midway upon the journey of our life, I found myself within a forest dark, for the straightforward pathway had been lost. So in literature, especially European literature, the forest is very often used to invoke the shadow side of our our experience, right? It's the dark wood. It's the place of confusion. It's the place of uncertainty and mystery. Even so much so that um, when Dante reaches the seventh circle of hell, he is confronted with a forest of souls who have committed suicide, right? And their punishment is to have their branches continually broken by these shrieking harpies in that forest. So very dark stuff. So I don't want us to imagine that trees and forests are always associated with warm and fuzzy feelings, but there's always a kind of a dark side to spirituality. In European fairy tales, trees and forests are also these places of transformation and uncertainty. Little Red Riding Hood, Hansel and Gretel, Seven Dwarves, Rapunzel, Robin Hood, Peter Pan. Some of our most sort of cherished fairy tales are set in these forests where the main characters have to either overcome some kind of obstacle or have to escape some kind of danger or encounter someone who isn't who they seem, right? So, a lot of these characters are kind of shape-shifting, and there's always something threatening in these places. In the mythology of Tolkien, we have a chat. What's this? Oh, okay, bye, Julie. In the mythology of Tolkien, the cosmology begins with the two trees of Valinor, Telperion, the male tree, and Laurelin, the female tree. The silver and the gold trees are the kind of the primary sources of light in this early cosmology that Tolkien imagined. In a kind of paradisiacal realm, right? It's like the paradise before the fall. But as you might imagine, it was quickly spoiled by evil creatures who destroyed the trees, and their last flower becomes the sun and the moon. So trees are the kind of source of the world, and that the way we imagine it, or the way Tolkien imagined it. And of course, in the realm of Middle Earth with The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, these very ancient beings, the Ents, they're not exactly trees, but they're tree-like beings who take care of the trees. And in terms of forests, Mirkwood is the sort of central massive forest of Middle Earth in the Third Age. There was a previous Mirkwood in the First Age, but the one that we hear the most about is the Mirkwood of the Third Age, where Sauron, when his power base expands, it becomes under the dark influence. And it's massive, right? It's 400 miles by 200 miles. But in the stories, Mirkwood is often this sort of place of transition between both geographically and for the storyline. So in The Hobbit, Bilbo Baggins and the dwarves have to try to get through Mirkwood in order to get to the mountain. But they get lost and are only rescued by the wood elves, right? There's pockets of these enormous spiders, and right. So the oak wood is imagined as being dark, and the good elves live in the beechwood areas that are brighter and with more light, and that have these kind of cathedral-like columns. So again, the forest in Tolkien takes on a lot of these European themes as being places of mystery and magic, transformation, transition, and both good and evil, dark and light. And in a contemporary maybe mythology, right, we could talk about James Cameron's Avatar, where the home tree is kind of central to the Na'vi communal life, right? They live in the tree. And their most religious or sacred practice is when they worship Iwa through the Tree of Souls, where they kind of plug in to the consciousness of Iwa through this world tree, right? This central axis mundi. And throughout the movie, there's lots of allusions to a kind of animistic or Hindu mythology in the world of the Natvi. And, you know, of course, there were critics of the film that said maybe it was too pagan, or some people thought it was maybe too colonialist because it, you know, it's the white guy who comes in and saves them, or that it was just misanthropic because it imagined human beings as being completely corrupt. But lots of really interesting tree and forest themes in that film. All right, so to conclude, just to sum up, like the huge whirlwind tour that we've taken of mythology and religion, trees are symbolic of the structure of the world. So their roots and branches and leaves connect heaven and earth. Human beings who are kind of upright and almost cruciform have that kind of tree-like shape. They're often imagined as being axis mundi, or centers of the world. In indigenous and in animistic cultures, trees are dwelling places of spirits. They're also sacred beings in and of themselves because they are life-giving. Forests are the domains of divinities. Often gods are associated with particular forests or particular trees, and nature spirits as well. So trees and forests have a kind of personhood that we've often forgotten about in modern Western culture. And lastly, in literature, trees and forests are zones of transition between geography and plot. They're places of uncertainty and magic. And they can also be very symbolic of a European fear of trees and forests and ambivalence towards trees and forests. We want to clear the trees and forests so we can see, right? So we often see trees and forests as being places of darkness, confusion, and danger. All right, so we'll come back together. Is anyone still awake? If anyone has any thoughts or questions.
That was a pretty thorough survey, Jace.
Thank you.
One thought I had, one thing you may want to consider adding to your consideration of the Christian Bible is the allegory of the olive tree.
Yeah, the olive tree is very important.
Yeah, and let's see, another thing that, and remember when Christ curses the fig tree too, that's sort of a symbolic condemnation of non-believers.
Yeah, that's a bit of a it's one you have to wrestle with, right? Why did he curse the fig tree when it wasn't even the time of being in fruit, right? So it's an interesting passage.
Right, and then the other thing, when you're talking about the Mormon tradition, you need to be sure to include Lehi's vision. That was, based in a.
Oh, right, the Mormon mythology around the tree of life, right? Is that a tree of life?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Cool.
So.
Any other thoughts? Questions?
Yeah, the fig tree, though, in the Hebrew Bible, the figs were used to heal Hezekiah's wounds.
Mm-hmm, yeah.
So that was used for healing in the Old Testament.
Right. Yeah, and I think in the New Testament, I think it's pretty allegorical. He's referring to his frustration with the Jews to recognize his role as Messiah and their inability to bear fruit. So I don't think he has anything personally against the fig tree so much as he's expressing a frustration with his fellow Jews.
So I have a comment more than anything, but John Prine's sort of last album before he passed away of COVID was entitled "The Tree of Forgiveness,"
Really?
and sort of the story goes, you know, that he's when he gets to heaven, he's going to open up a bar called the Tree of Forgiveness,
Yeah.
and it's kind of sort of that idea of popular culture and the way that it's also going and thinking about that transition. So I just love that the metaphor that he uses there. Recommend the album.
Yeah, like it's kind of a gathering place. Like we meet under the tree and
Yeah, and so it's this idea we have the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and we have all that, and the song, as it sort of goes, is he's gonna open up a bar and he's gonna smoke a cigarette that's 9 miles long, and he's gonna be able to partake of all the vices that we battled with here on Earth.
That's cool. I've been listening to him a lot lately, actually, John Prine.
Yeah, me too.
Well, yeah, it looks like Julia had to leave, but any other thoughts, comments? All right, well, let me share with you the, we'll just go over real quick the assignment for next week, which is related. Hopefully you can see this journal assignment 2 on the screen there. But I want you to kind of mind your own traditions. Jay was talking about some of his ideas, so this would be a good exercise for you to bring some of that to the fore. But pick a favorite work of scripture, fiction, myth, or poem that includes trees and or forest. Spend some time with this piece indoors if you have to, but maybe outside in a forest near a tree. And find it, maybe if you can, find a work that highlights a species in your area. That might be a stretch. But then maybe write a reflection on, I want you to reflect on how the tree is portrayed. Is it personified? Is it symbolic? Is it backgrounded? Does it have its own voice? And if it doesn't, maybe imagine what that tree might say, right? What is it that in that situation, if the tree was given a voice, it might say, or if it is given a voice, what does it say? Something along those lines. All right. And that should be in the syllabus, so. Cool. We put Tennille to sleep. She's already asleep. All right. Well, cool. Then thank you, everybody. Unless there's any other questions or comments, we can see you next week.
Thank you. That was great.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you, Jason. Take care.
Awesome. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.
All right. Good night.